Thanks for tuning into my little series here about tuning arrows for traditional bows. I'm far from an expert and I'm far from having perfect form, but I'm experienced enough and I've done this enough to feel as though any information I can put out there will lessen the learning curve for other newcomers. So if that's you, I hope you get something out of it. We'll start out pretty well just covering the basics, and as we progress we might get into a bit more detail about chasing a particular arrow build for a specific hunting application or even a target application potentially, but I'm pretty well coming at this from a hunting viewpoint, so please keep that in mind. Anyway, stick around and I hope you enjoy it. Cheers. Tuning arrows is talking specifically about making adjustments or modifications to an arrow to have it shoot perfectly in your bow for your draw length and your release style. It's a very personal thing, particularly when we're talking about a bow like this Black Widow, for example, that hasn't got an elevated rest. All I can do to the bow to make it perform a little bit differently is move my knocking height up and down and adjust my brace height, and maybe build out the shelf with some other material if I want to really fine tune some things. If we're going to step up in adjustability from this bow, we might be talking about a modern ILF traditional bow where you might have different rests, plunges, strike plates, whatever the case may be. And that offers a lot more adjustability than what's in this bow, but it's still less adjustability to something like a compound bow where you can have your sights, your rests, different release aids, all that kind of thing. So in bringing it back to what we're doing here, in order to get our setup to shoot as well as it can, we have to make all of our adjustments to the arrows. We're never going to get an arrow that's way out of tune for our bow and get it to shoot perfectly just by making adjustments to the bow. We have to do things to the arrow. The practical reasons why we tune our arrows is because we want them to fly through the air as efficiently as possible. If an arrow is not tuned particularly well, it'll come out of the bow a little bit sideways, which obviously creates more drag. Any feathers or fletchers you have on the back will have to work extra hard to correct the way that arrow flies, which means it'll slow down a little bit faster and potentially have a terrible trajectory. If we're talking about penetration through an animal, it's much easier to have an arrow go straight through an animal if it's traveling straight. It's very hard to push an arrow through an animal sideways. They're the practical reasons. For mental reasons, tuning an arrow will have a lot to do with your confidence in your abilities and your confidence in your gear. Even if your form is not perfect, because most of us don't have perfect form, if your form is most of the way there, then the amount of confidence you will develop as a result of tuning your arrows is huge. For that reason, I always suggest to people, as soon as your form allows you to be mostly consistent, start trying to tune some arrows, because you're going to learn something either way. Having said that, if your form is no good and you're just starting out, just get some standard arrows that are already fletched from a shop, go out with your bow, shoot those arrows and have some fun. Work on your form and don't really worry too much about all the other intricacies until you get to that point. You need to be able to measure your arrows. Not just measure the arrows themselves, but also make sure you're being precise with how much you are going to be cutting off at a time. You may be cutting off an inch at a time, or you may be cutting off a quarter of an inch at a time. So yeah, this tape measure works well for me. You could use whatever you like. It doesn't matter whether it's in inches or centimeters, as long as you're being consistent. However, typically speaking, when we're talking about archery, draw lengths, arrow lengths, everything is being talked about in inches, regardless of where you're from. You need something to cut your arrows. This little gadget here, I believe, is a pipe cutter or something. I bought it off eBay, I think, but you can find them in hardware stores fairly easily. Yeah, this served me well for a while, but I was cutting some aluminium with it maybe, and I think the blade in here got a bit blunt. So after that, my carbon arrows started to fray a bit when I was cutting them, which is not desirable, obviously. So I moved to using my Dremel, because I had it in the house already anyway. As long as you've got one of these thin cutting discs here, it can be a good way to go. It's a little bit hard to keep your cuts perfectly square, but I have a solution for that here, which I'll show you in a bit. Yeah, as long as you're careful, this can serve you well, and it's obviously better than maybe using a hacksaw or something along those lines. And a lot of us have these around our houses anyway. It's hard to justify spending a few $100 on a professional arrow saw when you're not really cutting arrows anywhere near as often as what people in shops are. So a Dremel can be a good option. You'll need an adhesive to stick your inserts into your arrows. This is one of the best that I've used. It's a glue made by Gateway. It says it's a no drip formula, so it's a bit more like a gel, so it doesn't run all over the place, and it's very impact resistant. So I haven't had any issues with this at all. I highly recommend it. However, in the initial tuning process where you may be wanting to pull the inserts or components out the front of your arrows, something like this, like a hot melt or a cool melt, this is made by Boning or Bonning, that might be a good option for you because you can put something in your arrow and then heat it up again and pull it out easy enough. So for the sake of making adjustments while you're finding your tune, something like this may work well, and then you can go back to the other glue when you've found what you want and you want something a little bit stronger. I tuned arrows for a couple of years before I owned an arrow spinner, so I wouldn't say it's essential, but it does make your life easier when you want to double check the way an arrow is behaving after you've put it together or something like that. I will say with this one though, made by ARWD, the reason why I find this one exceptionally useful is because it comes with this section which you can fit onto a side of it, and some of these abrasive patches. So you can put an arrow in here to spin it and rub it along this end here and actually square it off perfectly. So if your cuts aren't 100% clean, like mine sometimes aren't with my Dremel, this is a good way to square it up nicely and it'll fly brilliantly afterwards. This here may not be considered an essential piece of gear, but you do want to be able to sort out your knocking points. The brass ones are obviously more durable, but you need a special tool to be able to adjust them, whereas these ones here that I've tied on myself, you can wind them up and down to make the adjustments, which is great. And there are good videos on YouTube about how to do those, so I might put some of those in the description and you can go and have a look at them. The last thing you'll need to find a tune for your arrows is your points and your insert, outsert or collar components that will go on the front of your arrows, like this. So in the case of these ones here, I actually got a test kit which has 2 of each weighted field point between 100 and 200 grains in 25 grain increments. So if you have no idea what weight of broadhead you want to shoot or weight of point you want to shoot, this is a good way to go because it saves you having to buy sets of all those different weights. I also got some components to try out with the 350 and 300 shafts, ranging from super heavy, this all steel stuff goes all the way up to 175 grains if I want it to. And this here is a combination of a steel collar and an aluminium insert which goes between 85 and 105 grains depending on where I may decide to cut them. However, as I've already tuned up some arrows for this bow in the past, I know 350s would suit it fine, so I did buy a dozen 350s with all aluminium components based off previous tunes and knowing that somewhere around 255 grains would tune okay up front, so I got the all aluminium components so I can go between 65 and 45 grains if need be. Just wanted to go into a little bit more detail about these ARWD test kits because the folks at ARWD were kind enough to send me a kit to showcase in these videos in order to help promote their product for one, but also to show the traditional archery community that there are some really versatile options out there. And I've actually been talking with them a fair bit about tuning arrows and traditional archery form because they've picked up trad bows recently themselves. They've got a compound background, so that was really cool of them. So I'm stoked to have them supporting what I do, and I'm also stoked to maybe help a lot of other people realise that they've got a great product. I got a test kit sent to me with 300 and 350 spine because that's basically where the power of my bow may be sitting, but Most of us out there who are into hunting are probably shooting a bow between 50 and 60 pounds, so something in a 400 and a 350 spine might be best. So you can get 2 arrows in each spine rating and then select which components you might like to have come with those arrows. I know we mentioned before that you have to have something to cut your arrows if you're tuning, but once you figure out where your tune is, when you go to order more arrows, you can get them cut to whichever length you might need in 1/2 inch increments. And this is also the option where you can get the field point kits that I spoke about earlier as well. So if you don't have a lot of different field points at your disposal, this would be a good way to go, because then you can figure out what point weight might suit your tune the best, and then after you figure that out, you can invest in whichever field points you found afterwards. Besides the versatility of choosing which components you want to have sent, there's also the versatility within the components themselves, where you can cut the inserts down and have them weigh a little bit less if that's what you need. So if you've committed to using 200 grain broadheads, kind of like what I have, rather than reduce the weight of your point, you can reduce the weight of these inserts. And that's why I mentioned earlier about using that hot melt style glue, because you can put these inserts in, and if you find you need to take weight off the insert, you can heat them up, pull them out, cut some off and put it back in again. On your way you go. Tuning your arrows for me ultimately comes down to bareshafting. Bareshaft meaning shooting a shaft with no feathers or veins on the back, shooting it bare. You'll shoot a full length shaft with the desired point weight and component weight that you are hoping to end up with based on whether you're hunting or target shooting or whatever the case may be. And how that shaft comes out of your bow when you fire it gives you an idea about whether it's too weak or too stiff and what sort of adjustments you'll need to make. For the purposes of this demonstration, imagine that the archer is right-handed and they are standing where the camera is, and they've shot this perfectly tuned arrow directly square into the target. When you shoot your bare shafts, if they come out with a knock to the left, they're too weak. If they come out with the knock to the right, they're too stiff. And when I say come out, I'm not just talking about the way they might land in the target, I'm talking about the way they physically fly through the air, okay? Particularly with a target like this, it's packed full of plastic. You can't rely entirely on arrows landing in here consistently to give you an idea of what they're doing, which is why I like to double up and shoot into a solid Reinhardt target, as well as capture slow motion footage of my arrows coming out of the bow. And the slow motion footage is fantastic because pretty well everybody has a phone that can take slow motion video. And besides looking at how the arrows are flying, if the arrow does something you weren't expecting, you can usually look at your form or your release or whatever in that video and put the arrow behaving funny down to something that you have done and not an error with the arrow itself. Some people like to shoot into targets that are stacked horizontally, so it gives a really accurate reading. Some people like to shoot through paper and look at which direction the tears are in. They all work. It doesn't really matter what you choose to do, as long as you've got a consistent way of observing what your arrows are doing, so you know that when you start making decisions about adding or taking point weight on and off, or starting to cut them down, you need to know that those decisions are the right decisions. This camera here gives a 90-degree angle of the way the arrows have landed in the target. So if you have your nocking point set too high on your bow, the nocks will be high in the air like this when they come flying out of the bow, and they'll actually land like this. And that's why I spoke before about having nocking points that you can wind up and down and easily adjust on the fly, and start with your nocking point too high and gradually bring it down until they land mostly straight. Some people like to actually tune with their nock a little bit high and leave it there. It doesn't really hurt anything. If your nocking point is too low, sometimes your arrows may fly through the air like this and hit like this, but they can also land nock high in some cases, because the arrow will bounce off the shelf and it'll go through the air like a dolphin or a porpoise. So that's why it's always best to start high with your nock point and then gradually bring it down. The way I started my process was I said to myself, look, I've got lots of 200 grain broadheads. So if I can use a 200 grain tip from the get-go, I'm laughing because it means I don't have to invest money in more broadheads. Past experience has showed me that 350 spine arrows in this particular bow tune out fairly well with somewhere around 250 grains up front. So I opted for the all aluminium components, which is 65 grains total, but I can snip it back a little bit and reduce it to about 45 grains if need be. Let's say you've got your bare shaft organised, you've sanded down the front of your shaft, you've glued in the insert that you've got, you've slipped the collar over the top, and you've got the desired point weight that you have. You start shooting it and it comes out weak. It's pretty well what you want to see. It's what most of us will see, particularly if we're using a decent amount of weight up front for hunting purposes. Once you see it coming out weak, what you want to do is start to cut your shaft down. You can see here all the bits of leftover shaft I cut off in order to find where it tuned for my bow. I would recommend cutting them off in 1/2 inch increments. So cut off a 1/2 inch, shoot it a few more times, cut off a 1/2 inch, shoot it a few more times until you start to see it coming out fairly straight. Here I cut off the first couple of inches in one go because it was really weak, and I've done it enough times to know that I'd needed to get fairly short in order to tune out okay. And while we're on that, carbon to carbon, this arrow is now 28 1/4 inches, which is fairly short, but if you've got a fairly short draw length like I do, it's not really a problem. If you've got a long draw length and you can't cut very much off your arrows, otherwise they'll become too short for you, then you'll have no choice but to start mucking around with the point weights or the component weights a lot more. But for people like me with a short draw, load it up with the weight you want and start to cut it till it straightens up. Don't cut it until it comes out absolutely dead straight. Have it be just a little bit weak. Adding weight to the back of an arrow will actually stiffen it slightly, and the vanes and the feathers that we glue on the back of our arrows do weigh something, believe it or not. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it may be somewhere around 15 or 20 grains for 3 of these vanes on the back of an arrow. So that's significant enough to leave it a little bit weak. If I had 265 up front and the bare shaft came out stiff immediately, I mean, I knew I wouldn't, but let's just say it did, I would have then probably taken out these aluminium components and gone with something heavier to see if that might weaken it enough. If you use heavier components and the heaviest points you have available and it's still too stiff, you have no option but to go down an arrow spine. So let's just say you were using 350s, you had all the weight up the front you could find and it was still too stiff, step down to a 400. Having said that, even though these components here in particular are for 300 spines, but I've got them out for the demonstration purposes. If you use a 200 grain point and what we have here up to 170-ish grains of components, 375 grains up front is pretty savage. So you should be able to weaken almost any arrow you might desire with that setup. That's why taking advantage of these different test kits from ARWD is a really good idea, because if you think you might be sitting in between spines, you can order 2 of each and a couple of these different components and see what might tune out the best without having to invest all of that money in a dozen arrows and components. So it's a good way to go if you're trying to experiment a little bit. Something I like to do is do 2 bare shafts with the point weight up front, but then only start to cut one down and leave a bare shaft full length as a bit of a control, I guess you could say. So each time I cut down carbon off the arrow shaft I'm trying to tune, I can see just how much it's straightened up when it lands next to this full length bare shaft, or when I watch them both fly through the air with the slow motion footage. It's just something I like to do to help me feel comfortable with the fact I'm making good decisions about how much I need to cut off. Sometimes I even have my wife sit there and video my shot process, so if I have the arrows land a little bit funny, I can look for something I did wrong with my form to then, well, not have it be put down to the arrows, but have it be put down to human error, which hurts our egos a little bit more. But at the end of the day, if we know we are doing something wrong in our process, it's very hard to trust that the arrows will behave consistently. If you're like me and you're used to putting a lot of weight at the front of an arrow and have it come out weak and then start to cut it back gradually until you see it straighten up, you don't often get to see a stiff arrow come out of your setup. Now, I'm not saying you do want to see stiff arrows, but it's good to confirm that your form is consistent enough and predictable enough sometimes that you can again be confident in your knowledge, your understanding, and your form. So what I'm going to do here is shoot 3 arrows out of my bow. 2 of them have 265 grains up front. One of those is 32 inches long. It's the original length arrow. The other one is just over 28 inches where I found the tune for that weight up front. The other arrow is going to be the same length as the one that I tuned out, but I've got a 100 grain point as opposed to a 200 grain point. So in theory, I should have a weak arrow, a stiff arrow, and one in the middle. So we'll see how we go. Weak and a little knock high. Dead straight. Very stiff. The longer one did come out weak as predicted, not quite as weak as the original bear shafts that I was shooting, but I can put that down to my release. It did come out knock high though, which I knew it would because that extra length tends to make them behave that way, I found. Obviously this one here was the one that I've tuned with that amount of weight up front, and this one here has got less weight, so you can see it's come out stiff. The point of this whole thing is just another way you can develop confidence in your understanding of the process and in your form. It's very easy to become intimidated by this process if you are a newcomer, and I don't mean to say your form has to be bang on perfect in order to start tuning your arrows, but this is one way you can help develop your understanding of form and critique your own shots. So when you make decisions about cutting arrows or adding or reducing weight and things like that, you have a decent idea that they're going to perform the way you expect them to. Once I'd cut down the bear shaft enough that it was landing pretty well straight, I fletched it up and went to the range and had a few shots and watched those arrows fly. It's a beautiful thing when it all comes together. Flew beautifully, but I dropped it. Whew. I'll take that. See if I can do it again. Bet you I can't.